Three sides to every tale we tell. The truth is here, it's ringing bells.
Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're tackling Thinking Fast and Slow.
Oh yeah, a classic.
It really is. I mean, this book by Daniel Kahneman, it explores how our minds work and how we make decisions.
Right, and like the title suggests, it kind of boils down to two systems,
Yeah, system one, that's our fast intuitive thinking.
like gut feelings and quick judgments.
And then there's system two, slower, more deliberate, the analytical one.
Exactly. So throughout this deep dive, we're going to see how these two systems, they kind of work together, but sometimes clash, leading to some pretty fascinating, like, mental errors.
Yeah, like those moments where you're like, why did I do that? And this book, it gives us the answer.
So let's start with maybe one of the most well-known concepts from the book.
Heuristics.
Heuristics, exactly.
Okay, so for our listeners who haven't, haven't had a chance to dive into this book yet, can you explain what a heuristic is?
Sure. So heuristics are basically these mental shortcuts our brains use to make quick judgments.
Like rules of thumb.
Exactly. They're super useful for navigating everyday life. I mean, imagine if you had to, like, stop and analyze every single decision.
We'd be paralyzed.
Exactly. So heuristics help us to make quick and efficient decisions.
But the downside is...
There's always a catch.
Right.
So the problem with heuristics is they can lead to biases.
Okay, can you give us an example of that? Like how a heuristic can lead to a bias?
Sure. Let's talk about the availability heuristic. This is where we judge the likelihood of something happening based on how easily examples come to mind.
Oh, okay. I think I'm starting to see where this is going. So after a major plane crash, people might suddenly be more afraid of flying.
Exactly. Even though statistically, driving is much more dangerous.
But because plane crashes are so vivid and widely reported, they're easily recalled.
Right. And that makes us overestimate their likelihood.
So it's not really about the actual risk. It's about our perception of the risk, which is influenced by what's readily available in our memory.
Precisely. And this applies to, like, so many areas of life. Think about it. How often do your own fears and judgments stem from things that are just easy to remember, even if they might not actually be that representative of reality?
That's so true. It's like we create these mental models based on the information that's most readily available, not necessarily the information that's most accurate.
It's like our brains are constantly trying to tell a story.
Yeah.
And they use whatever material they have on hand.
And sometimes that leads to some pretty warped narratives.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay. So that's the availability heuristic. What are some other heuristics that we should be aware of?
Okay, well, another one is representativeness. This is where we judge whether something belongs to a category based on how well it matches our stereotype.
Oh, so it's like if you meet someone who's really into computers and video games, you might assume they're a software engineer.
Right, even though there might be plenty of accountants or teachers who also fit that description.
Our minds love to categorize, and we use stereotypes as shortcuts.
Exactly. And again, this can be useful in some cases, but it can also lead us to make inaccurate judgments.
Okay, so we've got availability, representativeness, what else?
Anchoring.
Oh, anchoring. This one's a classic. Like, I remember when I was reading the book, this was the one that really kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, anchoring is powerful.
So tell us, what is it?
So basically, anchoring is this tendency where exposure to a number can influence your subsequent estimates, even if that number is totally random.
Okay, so let's say I show you the number 100.
Right.
And then I ask you to estimate the population of, I don't know, some random city.
Okay.
You're more likely to give an estimate that's closer to 100 than if I had shown you a different number.
Exactly. That initial number, it acts like an anchor.
Right.
And it pulls your estimate towards it.
Even though it has absolutely nothing to do with the actual population of that city.
Right. And this is used all the time in marketing.
Oh, I was just thinking about that. Like when you see a product advertised as, originally $200, now only $99.
Right. That original price. Even if it's totally inflated, it anchors your perception.
So even if $99 is still overpriced, it seems like a good deal because you're comparing it to that higher anchor.
Exactly. Our minds, they love to take shortcuts.
Yeah.
And anchoring is one of the most powerful shortcuts out there.
So what we're seeing here is that all of these heuristics, they're driven by system one, the intuitive part of our minds.
Right. And that's why it's so important to be aware of them. Because system one, it's always working in the background.
It's like the autopilot of our brains.
Exactly. And sometimes the autopilot, it takes us in the wrong direction.
So we need to know when to take over the controls. and engage our system two, the more analytical, deliberate part of our minds.
Right, and that's what we're going to be exploring further throughout this deep dive, how to recognize those moments when our intuition might be leading us astray and how to engage our more rational thinking to make better decisions.
And speaking of system one, and it's sometimes the irrational ways, there's another concept from the book that I wanted to touch on, the halo effect.
Ah, yes, the halo effect. This is a fascinating one.
So it really is. Can you explain
Yeah.
for our listeners what the halo effect is?
Sure. So the halo effect is this tendency where a positive first impression can completely color our judgment of someone.
It's like we see one good thing about someone, and then we assume that everything about them is good.
Exactly. It's like they're wearing a halo, and it blinds us to their flaws.
I remember Kahneman tells a story in the book about how he was giving a talk, and he was really impressed by one of the other speakers.
He was charming, confident, well-spoken.
Right, and Kahneman initially thought, wow, this guy's brilliant.
But then later, when he actually stopped to analyze
Yeah.
the speaker's arguments, he realized they were actually pretty weak.
But that initial positive impression, it had already taken hold.
It's like our brains, they love to make quick judgments,
Yeah.
and then they stick to them.
Even when those judgments
Yeah.
might be based on superficial cues.
Right. So the halo effect, it's another example of how our system one thinking can sometimes lead us astray.
So what's the takeaway here? Like, how can we avoid falling prey to the halo effect?
Well, first of all, just being aware of it is a huge step. Knowing that it exists can help us to be more critical of our own judgments.
So if you find yourself instantly liking someone or instantly disliking someone, maybe take a step back and ask yourself, is this judgment based on substance, or am I being swayed by the halo effect?
Exactly. Engage your system two, your critical thinking. Don't just let your system one run the show.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about system one and its strengths and weaknesses. But what about system two? What's its role in all this?
Ah, system two, our lazy but brilliant friend.
Okay, I like that analogy. Tell me more.
So system two, it's the more deliberate, analytical part of our minds. It's capable of overriding system one's intuitive jumps and biases. But here's the catch. It's often lazy.
So it's like it has all the potential in the world,
Yeah,
but it doesn't always want to put in the effort.
exactly. And Kahneman, he illustrates this with a really simple experiment called add 3. Add 3. Yeah, it sounds simple, but it's actually surprisingly challenging. So in this experiment, people are given a series of 4 digits, and they have to add 3 to each digit while remembering the original sequence.
Okay, so like if I gave you the digits 4, 7, 2, 9, you'd have to say 7, 10, 5, 12, and remember the original sequence.
Exactly.
Okay, I could see how that would be. A bit tricky, but not impossible.
Right. But what this task shows is that engaging system 2, it requires effort. It's mentally demanding.
It's like our brains are wired to conserve energy, so we tend to avoid engaging system 2 unless it's absolutely necessary.
Right, cognitive misers, always looking for the easiest way out.
Which explains why we often fall prey to system 1's biases, even when we know better.
It's like our lazy system 2. It's saying, sure, system 1, whatever you say, I'm too tired to think.
That's a perfect way to put it. So it's this constant tug of war between our impulsive, intuitive system 1 and our slower, more rational system 2. And understanding this dynamic is key to making better decisions.
Exactly. It's not about completely silencing system 1. It's about knowing its limitations.
And knowing when to bring in the big guns.
Exactly.
This is fascinating. It's like we're peeling back the layers of our own minds. And speaking of peeling back layers, Kahneman then introduces this concept of the illusion of understanding.
Ah, yes. The illusion of understanding. This is a big one.
It really is. And it's something that I think we all experience in different ways. So can you break it down for us? What is the illusion of understanding?
So the illusion of understanding is this tendency we have to create coherent stories about the past, even if those stories are based on incomplete or flimsy evidence.
It's like we're all natural-born storytellers, and we can't resist creating a narrative, even if we don't have all the facts.
Right. Our minds crave order and predictability, so we weave these narratives that make sense of the past.
But the danger is that this can lead to overconfidence in our ability to predict the future.
Exactly. Just because we can tell a good story doesn't mean we actually understand what happened or what's going to happen next.
So we need to be wary of those narratives we create about the past and avoid extrapolating them into overconfident predictions about the future.
Absolutely. Recognizing the illusion of understanding is crucial for making more informed and realistic judgments.
Okay, that's a lot to think about.
It is. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to explore in Thinking Fast and Slow.
Well, I'm definitely hooked, and I'm sure our listeners are too.
So in our next part, we're going to delve even deeper into the world of biases and heuristics.
We'll uncover how loss aversion, framing, and other fascinating concepts can shape our decisions.
And ultimately how we can use this knowledge to make better choices in all areas of our lives.
So stay tuned.
We'll be right back.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the fascinating world of thinking fast and slow.
Yeah, we've been exploring how our minds work, those two systems, System 1 and System 2.
And how they sometimes lead us to make decisions that, well, aren't exactly rational.
Right, those pesky biases and heuristics.
Oh, yeah.
But the good news is, once you understand them, you can start to recognize them and hopefully avoid falling prey to them.
Exactly. So let's dive into another big one, loss aversion.
Ah, yes. Loss aversion. This is one of Kahneman's most well-known and influential concepts. And it's something that affects pretty much all of us.
Yeah.
In ways we might not even realize.
Okay, so what is loss aversion exactly? I've heard the term before, but I'm not sure I fully grasp it.
Sure. So loss aversion is this basic idea that the pain of a loss is felt more strongly than the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
So it's like losing $100 feels worse than finding $100.
Yeah.
Feels good.
Exactly. And Kahneman, he illustrates this with a really clever experiment using coffee mugs. Have you heard of this one?
Oh, yeah, the mug experiment. I've heard about it, but I'd love to hear you explain it.
Okay, so in this experiment, they take a group of students and they divide them in half.
Okay.
Half of the students are given a coffee mug, just a plain ordinary mug.
Right.
And then they're asked, how much would you sell this mug for?
Oh.
The other half of the students, they don't get a mug. They're just asked, how much would you pay for this mug?
Okay, so you've got the sellers and the buyers.
Exactly. And what they found was the sellers, those who already owned the mug, they demanded significantly higher prices than the buyers were willing to pay.
So even though it was the same mug, the fact that one group owned it changed their perception of its value.
Precisely. It's called the endowment effect. The mere fact of owning something increases its perceived value.
It's like once it's yours, you're less willing to part with it because it feels like a loss.
Right. And this has all sorts of implications for how we make decisions. Think about it. When you're selling something, are you being realistic about its value? Or is your attachment to it inflating the price in your mind?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's so true. It's like we get attached to things and then we overvalue them.
Exactly. And this can also play out in negotiations.
Oh, yeah. Like when you're so afraid of losing something
Yeah.
that you end up making concessions you wouldn't otherwise make.
Right. Or you might hold on to a bad investment for too long because you're so focused on avoiding the loss that you don't see the bigger picture.
So how can we overcome this loss aversion bias?
Well, awareness is key. Just knowing that it exists can help you to be more objective in your decision making.
So like taking a step back and really thinking about the true value of something, both what you stand to gain and what you stand to lose.
Exactly. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment.
Okay, that makes sense. So we need to be aware of the endowment effect and how it can warp our perception of value.
Right. And also how loss aversion can make us more risk averse than we might otherwise be.
Which can hold us back from making bold decisions or taking chances.
Exactly. So loss aversion, it's a powerful force. But by understanding it, we can start to make more rational and informed choices.
This is all so fascinating. It's like I'm starting to see the world through a whole new lens.
That's the power of thinking fast and slow. It really does change the way you view yourself and the world around you.
Speaking of which, there's another concept from the book that I wanted to talk about. Framing.
Framing. This is another one of those really sneaky biases that can have a huge impact on our decisions.
Okay, so what is framing?
So framing is basically the idea that the way a choice is presented can influence our decision, even if the options are objectively the same.
So it's like how you spin something.
Exactly. It's all about the presentation, the wording, the context, all of that can affect how we perceive the choices.
Okay, so can you give us like a real world example of this?
Sure. One classic example is from a study where they asked people to choose between two different treatments for a disease outbreak.
Okay.
But they framed the choices differently. For one group, they said, treatment A will save 200 lives.
Okay.
For the other group, they said treatment B will result in 400 deaths.
Oh, okay, but mathematically, those are the same thing.
Exactly, just a different way of framing, the same outcome. But what they found was people were much more likely to choose treatment A when it was framed in terms of lives saved.
So, even though the options were objectively the same, the way they were framed made a huge difference.
Right, because our minds, they're drawn to the positive. We want to gain things. We want to avoid losses. And framing can tap into those underlying motivations.
So it's not just about the information itself. It's about how that information is packaged and presented.
Exactly. And this is used all the time in marketing, in politics, in everyday conversations.
So we need to be aware of this and try to see through the framing to the actual substance of the choices we're making.
Absolutely. Don't let yourself be swayed by clever wording or emotional appeals. Take a step back and think critically about the information you're being presented with.
Okay, that's a great reminder. So we've got loss aversion, we've got framing. What other sneaky biases do we need to be aware of?
Well, there's one more that I think is particularly thought-provoking, and that's the distinction between the remembering self and the experiencing self.
Oh, yes, the two selves. This is the one I've been really looking forward to talking about.
Yeah, this is one of those concepts that really makes you think about the nature of experience and memory.
So for our listeners who might not be familiar with this idea, can you explain what the two selves are?
Sure. So basically, we have two different selves that experience life in different ways. We have the experiencing self, which is the self that lives in the moment and feels things as they're happening.
Right.
And then we have the remembering self, which is the self that looks back on experiences and creates memories.
And those two selves don't always see eye to eye.
Exactly. Because the remembering self that doesn't have access to the full richness of the experience.
It just has the highlights, the lowlights, and the ending.
Right. And Kahneman, he illustrates this with a really interesting experiment called the cold hand experiment.
Oh, I've heard about this one. It sounds kind of unpleasant.
Is a bit. So in this experiment, they had participants submerge their hand in painfully cold water for a certain amount of time. And then they were given a choice to repeat either the same experience or a slightly longer experience. That ended with the water being slightly less cold.
So they had to choose between a shorter, more painful experience
And a longer.
less painful experience.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is many participants chose to repeat the longer, more painful experience.
Really? Why would they do that?
Because it ended on a less painful note. So even though the longer experience involved more total discomfort, the remembering self focused on that less painful ending and judged the overall experience to be better.
So it's like our memories are biased towards the peak and an end of an experience.
Exactly. And this has all sorts of implications for how we make choices and how we evaluate our lives.
It's like we might choose to endure something unpleasant if we believe the ending will be good, even if it means more suffering in the long run.
Right. Or we might remember a vacation fondly, even though we were actually pretty miserable for most of it.
So we need to be aware of this discrepancy between our experiencing self and our remembering self and try to make choices that are in the best interest of both.
Exactly. It's about finding a balance between living in the moment and reflecting on the past.
This is all so mind-blowing, I feel like. I'm learning so much about how my own mind works.
And we've only just scratched the surface. Thinking fast and slow.
Yeah.
It's a book that you can keep coming back to and keep finding new insights.
Wow. I feel like our brains are getting quite the workout here.
Yeah, thinking fast and slow. It really does make you think, doesn't it?
It does. It's like we've been taking this deep dive into the inner workings of our own minds.
Right. And all these biases and heuristics we've been talking about, they're not just some abstract concepts. They're actually affecting our decisions every single day.
And in ways that we might not even realize. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways? Like, what can our listeners do to start applying these insights in their own lives?
Well, I think one of the most important things is just to be aware of the potential pitfalls of our thinking.
To recognize those moments when our intuition might be leading us astray.
Exactly. And Kahneman, he gives us some really helpful tips for doing this.
Like what?
Well, one thing he talks about is recognizing the contexts
Yeah.
where these biases are most likely to occur.
Oh, okay. So it's like knowing the warning signs.
Yeah. For example, when decisions are emotionally charged or when we're under time pressure, that's when system 1 really tends to take over.
So if you're feeling stressed or rushed, or if
Yeah.
the stakes are high, maybe take a step back
Yeah.
and really think things through.
Exactly. Don't let your emotions drive the decision.
And another thing Kahneman talks about is the importance of outside perspectives.
Yeah, this is huge. When you're too close to a situation, it's hard to see things objectively.
You're stuck in your own head.
Exactly. So talk to someone who's not emotionally invested,
Yeah.
someone who can offer a more neutral perspective.
It's like having a sounding board to bounce ideas off of.
Right. And sometimes just hearing someone else's point of view can help you to see things in a whole new light.
And to challenge your own assumptions, which is so important because we all have biases.
We do. And one of the most pervasive biases is overconfidence. We all tend to think we're smarter than average and that we're less susceptible to biases than other people.
But that's just not true.
It's not. We're all human and we all make mistakes. So it's important to be humble and to recognize the limits of our own knowledge.
To acknowledge that we might be wrong.
Exactly. And to be open to learning from our mistakes.
Well, I think this has been an incredibly enlightening deep dive.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure exploring thinking fast and slow with you.
And I hope our listeners have found it as fascinating as we have.
I think anyone who's interested in understanding how their mind works and how to make better decisions will really enjoy this book.
It's definitely a must-read. So on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into thinking fast and slow.
Thanks for joining us.
And remember, thinking slow can often lead to better outcomes.
Welcome to the show we're in. News to share, where to begin. Free sides to every tale we tell. The truth is here, it's ringing bells. Dive in deep, let's take a look in every twist and turn we took. For glory lies within the truth. We're chasing facts, it's our pursuit.